This is a conversation with three esteemed authors of a paper entitled Russian Sabotage in the Gig Economy Era. It is written by Daniela Richterova, Elena Grossfeld, Magda, and Patrick Berry. I'm delighted to be joined by three of the authors of the paper on today's talk. And here's the introduction. We are experiencing the most intense era of sabotage since the Second World War in Western countries. Russian operations have now reached unprecedented levels. It seems the main aim is to increase the costs of supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia, while at the same time slowing the delivery of military supplies. Russian operations are increasingly organized around a gig economy principle. The dangers are mounting from operations that have an element of plausible deniability that can scale while still causing significant damage and sowing terror. Well, we will, of course, put links to the description where you can find the full paper and read it. And of course, it comes highly recommended. But before we jump into that, I will ask our three guests to briefly introduce themselves. Let's start with Elena.
Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London at the War Studies Department, and my research concentrates on strategic culture of KGB and Russian intelligence.
And Daniela.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Daniela Richterova. I'm an associate professor at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and I focus on Central Eastern European intelligence and security.
Hi, good evening, Jonathan. Thank you very much for having us. My name is Magda. I'm a visiting research fellow at King's Centre for Study of Intelligence at King's College London. My research examines how states use covert influence operations to pursue their foreign policy objectives, mitigate national security threats, and as a tool in hybrid warfare.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think this is such an important subject. It's one that doesn't get nearly enough coverage, at least enough coverage that I think it deserves. Well, let's turn to that first question in the abstract of your paper, which is this idea that it's the most intense era of sabotage since the Second World War. And I think the first question people will ask is, but we had the Cold War. We surely had acts of sabotage taking place. So what are the fundamental differences between Cold War rules and operations and what we're seeing coming out of Russia now?
I mean, we have quite a lot of evidence on how various states used sabotage during World War II. There's good evidence on how the Soviet Union used sabotage. There's British and American sabotage manuals available online. So we have good evidence of that. But we don't have good evidence of either side using sabotage during the Cold War. I think in our minds, we do think that sabotage was a major component of the Cold War. And we know that there were plans devised in the Soviet Union and in some of its satellite states, by East Germany or Czechoslovakia. But as far as we can tell, these weren't in any systematic way put into place or acted upon. In our research, we looked at Czechoslovak files, which are fantastic and really thorough and are not redacted. And we saw that the Soviets advised the Czechoslovaks to set up a sabotage unit to really devise very detailed plans to carry out sabotage operations against various oil pipelines in the West or NATO facilities, etc. But the Czechoslovaks never went ahead with any of these because they were seen as kind of your one of your last resort types of operations. Now, we don't have such good coverage or evidence of KGB operations. What we do know of the KGB, we do know that it used, it did use some sabotage operations against its dissidents, but we don't really have any specific hard evidence detailing any operations, sabotage operations by the KGB. This is not to say that there weren't any. I'm absolutely sure that there were plans, and perhaps there were some that we will see evidence of in the future. But I would say that during the Cold War, sabotage was not your go-to everyday tool to destabilize the West, although plans were in place in case the Cold War became hot at some point.
Well, this is probably a good question to fire at either Magda or Elena. Given that these plans are potentially on record, we don't know the full scope, but we have some inkling of what they might have contained, and yet the Soviet Union did not necessarily act upon them. What Putin's doing now, has he just gone and dusted these plans off and gone, here we go, here's a blueprint for how we behave? or are they innovating and improvising?
I'll just say that I think that there's a continuation of their efforts, and some of the plans that they are enacting are the plans that have been thought through or about during the Cold War, indeed, and they have great similarities. But Elena can tell you a little bit more about how they've changed and how innovative they've become since then, and what are some of the key features that we're seeing today that we would not necessarily have seen during the Cold War.
I think the main difference is that they abandoned all pretext of quality control. You know, during the Cold War, the sabotage was left in the hands of professionals, like specific and trained agents, whether part of the intelligence organization or, you know, outsiders that were brought in, but still were trained and appear to have been dedicated for this specific task. And what we see now is that jobs are being, you know, farmed out on messaging applications to the lowest bidder, maybe even, you know, like, oh, who wants to paint a graffiti in Paris? Okay, here you go, $50 there, you know, this is your chance, without regard of the training or whether they will be caught, or what will be the implications for the people who actually, you know, send and task them with that.
So this is a key question, and let's get Magda to weigh in on this. So it seems that there are certain tools and possibilities that are being used, irrespective of you know, the breakdown in rules or the difference in rules between Cold War and now. There's things like Telegram, there's telecommunications that allow for encrypted communication. There is a sort of gig economy culture, the idea of outsourcing terror and violence. And of course, we saw the experiments in that taking place in Donbass, in the outsourcing of Russia's invasion in the early phases of the war in 2014. So what is it about the modern economy that enables Russia to innovate and do this very different kind of sabotage operation?
Well, in essence, the difference is that this gig economy is actually a free market, largely online system, where short-term positions are prevalent and organizations employ freelance workers for temporary jobs and engagements through these digital platforms and apps. And in essence, this is what we're seeing Russia do. It's an easy to access platform and way to temporarily and largely impersonal, more informal and non-contractual way to engage people, random people, if you will. That's the way in which it breaks with the previous intelligence outsourcing for sabotage operations. It mirrors many ways in which information communication technology enabled platforms are used by organized crime and terrorist groups. And if when these tasks are conducted and when people are selected for particular jobs, oftentimes they're separated and segregated. So one person does not know whether they're working together with somebody or not, which again, it doesn't make them a part of a larger team, and it reduces or enhances the deniability for the hiring party. So whether it's an intelligence agency or some organized crime group looking to do some work. So in essence, recruiting criminals and ordinary citizens such as lawyers and teachers and software engineers, it just shows the breadth and depth of the recruitment pool that they have available now. And whether these people are willing or unwitting participants, false flag recruitment is expected to grow and be easily achieved, more easily than in the analog world. So this is where gig economy sabotage is likely to increase in number of unwitting civilians conducting these operations.
Well, we'll turn to recruitment and handling in a minute, but there's another aspect you've highlighted in the paper, which is the increasing use of encrypted financial transactions. So is this another aspect of the modern economy that enables this kind of intelligence operation and makes it far less easy, as it were, to track and trace what is going on? The use of encryption services, the use of shell companies, but of course also the use of cryptocurrencies and so on.
Sure, I can take this one. Just one correction on the previous question. Telegram in itself is not an encrypted platform. You know, you can set up personal chats between two people to be encrypted, but in a channel, which is presumably where the recruitment is going on, those are not encrypted. So, you know, it probably speaks to the penetration of Telegram by the Russian intelligence, but you know, just to dot the i's on the encrypted payments. You know, like during the Cold War, it was not unusual to travel for intelligence organizations to travel with suitcases with cash. But in today's world, you will have a hard time doing that. And most of the banks in the West, at least, have been implementing the know your customer and anti-money laundering practices and things like that. And so conveniently, there's the cryptocurrencies now, which are, although the exchanges that are set up in the West are regulated and also enforce a sort of know your customer and anti-money laundering practices, there are enough exchanges in the world, including Russia and elsewhere, that do not have any limitations on that. And so the payments that are done through crypto exchanges are easy for the paymasters, easy for the workers, but there's also anonymous wire transfers, right? Like you can receive a wire transfer into your bank account from whoever, because in a gig economy you're being paid for micro work, and so you can receive small amounts without triggering any interest on behalf of the bank to open yourself up for suspicion. So of course those platforms are being used for all sorts of criminal practices as well. And it ties very neatly with the connections between the intelligence and criminal networks.
Well, let's turn to the other aspects of how sabotage would traditionally be handled. You'd have to have the recruitment of agents, and as you mentioned earlier, potentially trained agents. You'd have to have some kind of handling of them, fostering those networks, trying to evade sort of monitoring and so on. So you have potentially a very expensive set of actions required to build and implement networks before they've even carried out any sort of acts of sabotage, assassination, and so on. Now this new technique where they use so-called external contractors or agent executioners, what are the requirements here for the role of the traditional intelligence officers within these networks?
I think that's the million-dollar question, Jonathan, and we will find that out one day when one of them escapes and comes to your podcast and tells us about this. But we do have a pretty good idea about how this was set up during the Cold War, even during the 80s, because the Soviets came to a number of the satellite countries and told them how to set these networks up. And so I would say that there was almost your pyramid of operatives that was set up for these purposes. So at the top of the pyramid was a case officer, so someone who was working for either the KGB or the East German or the Czechoslovak intelligence service, an officer who was sent somewhere abroad, and he was managing a number of agents. One type of agent he could have been handling would be access agents. So these would be agents who would be, who would work at a particular facility or interested in perhaps, setting on fire or damaging in another way. So they would be keen in providing access when the moment came for the sabotage operation to be carried out. There were other types of agents, for instance, agents keepers, who could help house and provide kind of infrastructure for the agents executioners or agent saboteurs. And these agent saboteurs would be sometimes third country nationals, sometimes they would be Soviet or Soviet bloc nationals. And as Elena said already, they would be trained typically in how to handle some of these explosives. They would be either trained by that a particular officer based in the West, or they would be asked to go to the Soviet bloc and train there. And in the event of war, these case officers or the KGB and other services knew that these officers would probably be recalled or PNG'd, as we've seen actually over the past couple of years. This has happened to the Russians in Europe and other countries as well. So they had a backup plan of how to run these sabotage operations in that case. And that backup plan were the so-called illegals, so deep cover officers who would be based in the West anyway. And we see that Russia still has people like that, these illegals based in the West, but also globally, who would step in and basically do the job of the case officer, so run that network of agents. So this is kind of how it was set up, and we have evidence showing us how this pyramid of operatives was basically set up in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. I would be surprised if it worked, differently up until that point of who you recruit to execute that sabotage operation. And that's what we're arguing in this piece, is that now you don't really need these, as you said, expensive agents who are often, coerced into engaging in these sabotage plans. They were often petty criminals who, were arrested for monetary machinations or for importing, banned goods, and were then coerced into being these agents, executioners. Now, as we know, we don't have evidence of these sabotage operations being carried out during the Cold War, so we don't have evidence of agents, saboteurs carrying out sabotage, but we do have evidence of agent saboteurs trying to assassinate dissidents abroad. Actually, the person who assassinated Georgy Markov, one of the most iconic assassinations of the Cold War, the Bulgarian dissident who was killed allegedly by an umbrella in London. So he was allegedly executed by someone who was basically an agent executioner, someone who was coerced into doing this for the Bulgarians, had to be trained. So it was expensive, not only financially, but also in terms of time. And that's, I think, what we're arguing here, is that because you can now recruit people online, you can turn this around and basically shrink this process into several days. And this process would otherwise take, I would say, months or sometimes longer.
And that was going to be my next question, whether there are certain tasks that are definitely within the remit of these agent executioners, or whether they could be called upon to do everything, because we recently have the example of an attempted assassination of a senior executive in the German military-industrial complex. We have incendiary packages apparently put on aeroplanes, which resulted in fires in both the UK and Germany. Do we understand that, is there any limits to the kind of operations that would be outsourced and those which would perhaps be retained under direct control of Moscow and more experienced agents?
So I don't think, again, that we have good evidence on this, but I think what most people are arguing is that some of the very high-profile operations, for instance, the assassination of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, or Sergei Litvinenko, those, as far as we understand from the investigations that have already been concluded, but also the ones underway, were carried out by officers of Russian intelligence services, so not by contractors, not by agents, executioners. So I think at this point, the consensus is that if it's a high-profile, delicate operation against this a high-value target, then you would go for an officer. But that might have also changed with the war, because it is more difficult for them to travel. They have been compromised. So I think we need to watch this space and unfortunately see who is engaged in future attacks. We might see some professionals, officers of either GRU or SVR, be engaged in this. But I wouldn't be surprised if actually Russia was using more and more of these agents, amateurs, you could call them, because of the restrictions on travel and other issues that have to do with sanctions caused by the war.
Yeah. Sorry, if I can add there was this case of an attack on the Russian dissident in one of the Baltics, I believe in Lithuania. And this attack was, when a person was hit with a baseball bat or, some heavy object and sustained some broken bones and had to be to seek medical attention. This case was a Polish citizen who was part of some bodybuilding far right organization. So you can see that those type of activities are also being outsourced, and probably as Daniela mentioned, due to travel complications and the time that is required, it's much easier to find willing perpetrators on the ground, and it's also much cheaper. And it also provides this additional layer of deniability. We're like, some football hooligan attacked a Russian dissident. We have nothing to do with it.
And given that they're forced to do this because many of their agents are expelled, who are operating under the guise of sort of diplomatic status, now they've discovered that it's possible to outsource. Is there a compelling cost argument to mount a similar operation? Is it tremendously cheaper to use these outsourced methods they've been forced to innovate? And now they've discovered that, are they likely to be able to sort of scale these operations, which would have been perhaps prohibitively costly before? If we think of the amount of sort of planning resources that went into assassinating Alexander Litvinenko or Skripal, one can conceive that it would cost a vast amount of money to mount those operations. Now they can do many, many more things for considerably less. Magda?
I think we're seeing, obviously, that, as you've explained, there is a reason why they're using this method to engage whether unwitting participants or willing criminals who want to do this kind of work, because of these challenges that intelligence officers are having. But I think that the reality is that this is something that is going to continue, and it is going to be a very popular method of engaging random people for lower level operations to cause disruption in other societies. It's not necessarily we're focusing maybe a little bit too much on whom are they hiring and who are these people who are participating in these activities. But I think the underlying message and focus should be on what are they trying to accomplish here? What are the Russians trying to accomplish by engaging these individuals? Sabotage on its own, it's not going to be enough, and it's not necessarily going to provoke people, let's say, an Article 5, right, or response of Article 5. But in essence, it's something that takes attention away from important issues, and it makes states focus on something that is disruptive to target states. So it's not necessarily that it's just convenient for them, and the cost obviously is a factor here, but it's also something that puts the target state in a precarious position, because it complicates the response to it. The target state, every state that has experienced these issues will have different red lines. It will have different responses to it. It will have different mechanisms to mitigate the threat coming from these actors. And I think this is where the challenge is. It's not necessarily just the cost-effective way for Russia to cause or to send a message, if you will, or to do sabotage acts like sabotage, but it's also, it puts this target state in a very precarious position on what to do. How do we respond to this threat? What is the threat, and how do we deal with it broadly as a society, as an international society as well?
And that was definitely going to be the next area to focus on. And the bit that I don't quite understand here is that even though there's plausible deniability, there must be people in professional and political circles who have a strong suspicion who is behind these things. And and maybe they can't sort of publicly come out and point the finger, but they will understand that they are under attack. If the main priority at the moment is to deter and prevent Western allies from supporting Ukraine or providing military aid to Ukraine, do you think acts of sabotage actually have that kind of deterrent power?
I don't know if my colleagues agree with me. I actually don't think that they do, in essence, have the deterring power to stop or to prevent the Western powers from continuing to support Ukraine. They're a nuisance. They cause issues. They even sometimes cause a loss of life. But I believe that the Western powers are catching up with all these acts that the Russians have been committing, and they're dealing with it in their own various ways, whether that's as a part of the part of NATO and intelligence operations and sharing intelligence, whether it's law enforcement agencies cooperating with intelligence agencies to deal with this issue, whether it's changing laws, whether it is actually calling Russia out directly and explicitly and holding Russia responsible for these activities. I think from my perspective and from what I'm seeing, if anything, the Western powers are using other means to hold Russia responsible, such as diplomatic and economic means, so sanctions or expelling intelligence officers, closing down intelligence locations, if you will. I know that the UK had closed down several or took away, not closed down, sorry, they took away diplomatic privileges for several facilities that they could that they believed that were used for intelligence purposes. So each state is dealing with this in a different way, and whether it's I wouldn't call it a deterrent, I would call it a nuisance and more of a maybe making Western powers come together even closer to respond to this ever-growing problem.
I think also it's a part of a strategy to sort of overload the systems and to make citizens question various events. Like, for example, in Germany, a train is being delayed. And from what I understand, it's been very common lately in Germany. Is it because of the sabotage? Is it because somebody, destroyed some equipment on the rail line that prevented the train from arriving? Or what is going on now with naval issues in Norway? There's this Russian ship that is standing there that is supposedly loaded with explosives to the gills. Is it part of the sabotage? Should they block it from the entry? What's going on? And so this strategy of overloading the system with seemingly minor events that might be connected but might not be, and then the speculations on the side of the states create additional weight to it. It's very convenient, for Russia, for very small amounts and for very little effort. If we're taking the old approach, the Cold War approach, when you need to have intelligence officers on the ground, case officers running networks, and now all you need to do is have an intelligence officer sitting in Moscow with a telegram on his cell phone and, running, I don't know, hundreds of networks at the same time.
Daniela, did you want to have a crack at this as well, what the overall strategic objective may be?
Yeah, why not? I think we can read again, look at some of the Cold War documents we have on this, and they basically say it on black and white, that the goal there is to demoralize your opponent in a way, basically, where you're systematically undermining a certain policy or a decision, be it political or military decision that they have taken on. And by just causing a lot of disruption that is clearly noticed by the public, and thus creating an environment of perhaps chaos within the public, and perhaps suggesting to the public through these kinetic operations that their leaders, if their leaders just drop these policies that are irritating Moscow, they might be better off. So that was one of the goals. Another goal was to undermine unity. And to undermine unity of NATO, as Magda said, I don't think we're seeing that right now. I hope we won't be seeing that in the years to come. But that was the rationale in Moscow: was if we do this against some members and maybe not against others, then we'll kind of create differences there, and then drive division between them. The other undermining of unity was meant to be aimed at political parties, and here I am a bit more worried. I don't know what Magda and Elena would think about this, because we might see, and we are seeing obviously, political parties in various places in Western Central Europe which are pro-Russian, and so one of the goals of Sabotage is to undermine kind of political or sense of political direction within, among various political parties. So in this respect, we might see in the future some parties which will openly argue, if we stop providing weapons to Ukraine, our trains might not be running late, or maybe, some of the more visible attacks, such as arson attacks, or, our factories which produce these this ammunition or this military hardware might not be attacked. So I think, again, we'll have to see if someone picks this up, and if they do, let's see what the public thinks about that. I would hope that the public would not vote for a political party that would center their message around this, but it can drive further division between some of the political environments in Western Europe.
I mean, this is a fascinating issue, isn't it? Because essentially, if a party is going to leverage this, if we appease Russia, essentially, then these problems will go away, or we won't have to experience these problems. That is directly a form of appeasement. But we also have the problem, is it appeasing if the media and politicians who are aware of these acts taking place, but seek to mute any discussion around them? That might seem strategically sensible from one level, but it is also a form of appeasement, or it could be taken to be that by the perpetrators of it.
I think one of the I don't think that the discussion about what's happening is muted in that respect. I think we're seeing a lot of politicians, and we're seeing a lot of media representatives talking about the issues that we're facing, and the whether this is called appeasement or not. I think we're seeing arguments on both sides, and I think the article that we have written and cited numerous sources where we've identified this information. There's obviously a debate going on amongst the politicians, amongst the policymakers, amongst the media representatives. But I think one of the crucial aspects of this discussion has to consider the influence of information and disinformation campaigns, and its role in driving these discussions and these debates. And this is where we in the West could do a better job of educating our voters and our people on what it is, what is disinformation, what is misinformation, how to recognize, and being more aware that this is happening, right? Because one of the goals of disinformation campaigns and for Russia is to and as they refer to it as it's a psychological warfare, right? So they will use fear, panic, horror, and target the population to present this. And if we're having this debate of whether we should or should not support Ukraine, or whether we should appease Russia because these acts will stop further, then we should also have a debate about the narrative that is being presented by foreign states and other actors in our society to influence these decisions. Because this is not just coming out of the vacuum, and it's not something that just appeared overnight. It's clearly something that states like Russia, and they're not the only ones, are targeting societies in the West with these messages and spreading fear, panic, and horror, because they want to influence their mind. And we're not having this debate about the cognitive influence of information campaigns by hostile actors and in the cognitive domain, and how we can deal with this as a bigger issue.
Well, this is a question I wanted to put to all of you, actually, because obviously in the modern Russian military doctrine, information plays an incredibly important role. It is a multi-layered form of aggression, and yet the media often fails to see it as such. It'll look at certain things like Kursk on one plane and critique it on one plane, whereas, and this was a Ukraine operation, but Russian aggression exists on a multiple planes, multiple levels. Do we also need to see sabotage in the same way? Is information and cognitive warfare an intrinsic part of these sabotage operations as well, in order to amplify the impact of them?
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly say that again, this is something that we see in the doctrine that the Czechoslovaks, after their meeting with the Soviets, wrote down and said, this is important because it helps remind the public these various information operations, remind the public of some of the kinetic operations we might be doing, and thus amplify their effect. For instance, I mean, we would argue that we've seen a number of failed, but also some successful sabotage operations against France. Arguably, the cutting of the disruption in the run up to the Olympic Games would be one of them. But what we have seen also in France are these information operations, right? So or more kind of demonstrative active measures, as they would have been called in the East during the Cold War. For instance, as we mentioned in the article, someone dumped a bunch of coffins wrapped in French flags close to the Eiffel Tower. Now, that's a very powerful message that followed shortly after President Macron was suggesting that at some point France might send soldiers to Ukraine. So, I think that you can communicate a very powerful visual or other message through these information operations, and we know that they are part of the sabotage doctrine. They're meant to amplify and keep kind of digging that little hole into the minds of the public, but also policymakers, and that uncertainty of whether they should really continue in opposing Russia or opposing the Soviet Union during the Cold War, if this is what is at stake, if this is sabotage and other operations are what they get in return.
I am reminded a bit of the old slogan, if you remember it in Europe, better red than dead. And how that was it was a very successful operation, scaring or instilling fear in Europeans that the potential nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the US is going to be happening in their backyard or in their front yard, wherever they are located, and how the citizens should object to the placement of American missiles and all that good stuff, with people chaining themselves up in front of some military bases and creating a big noise. So in that sense, you could definitely say that the potential sabotage operations tie in very nicely with the psychological warfare, and part of the psychological warfare is to instill uncertainty and fear, and this is definitely in the Russian manuals as well. I mean, it's been discussed. And another angle is to present Ukrainians and Russians who are living in the West as untrustworthy because, look, they are engaging in all those operations. That could be a nice byproduct of this gig economy sabotage operation, because why are you letting those people in? Why are you helping dissidents and objectors and Ukrainians when they are the ones, like a fifth column again in your backyard or front yard?
And they could either simulate that, they could have, I guess, people pretending to be Ukrainians. They may even be able to tap into Ukrainian criminal networks that are now part of sort of displaced communities.
And some of them have been, legitimate Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine who have been in the West for a while, since the Donbass, 2014, and who have been unable to find steady jobs, put roots in their new place, and don't have the skills to survive in modern economy and want to better their, lot in life. And this is the job that you find on Telegram. I mean, $50, who could say no?
Yes, I agree, and this makes things a little bit easier for them to claim if they find. Sorry, let me try it again. If they find Russian sympathizers who are willing to do these acts for them and who are willing to do it for free, or whether to show that they're pro-Russian, that's not an unwitting participant who doesn't know what they're doing. That is somebody who's already made up their mind that what Russia's doing in Ukraine is the right way to do it. But oftentimes you will have desperate people, right, and who are looking for just an additional funds to support themselves. And for Russia, it doesn't matter that if they use information operation to portray that the entire nation of Serbia, the entire nation of Georgia, the entire nation of some other countries in their corner in this, and they will say that they're supporting them. Who's there to contradict this? They can make up whatever story they want to make up, and it's really difficult to track down these people and who they are and how they're responding and why are they acting the way that they are acting. So do we believe them when they say that they're unwitting and they have no idea that they were working for the Russians, or do we actually try to scratch beneath the surface and actually try to bridge the connection with the intelligence services, for instance? And I think this is where the approach that we've been talking about in the article can highlight the depths of this problem for governments and policymakers and intelligence analysts, as well as for just poor people who are just looking, for an extra buck or two to make their lives a little bit more sustainable.
Well, I want to loop back on that point because you've all made the point that this is potentially a simple and economic way to scale up some of these operations of a certain type. Is there an interesting other side to the equation that actually it's very expensive to counter these operations if you want to nip them in the bud, or even the follow-up from these operations to try and discern who's actually behind it? I imagine that isn't cheap, and that does require professional resource. So what's your view on that and the responses of Western intelligence services, police, and so on?
Yeah, go for it. I'd like to say something after you, Dan, as well, so go for it.
Same here.
We're too chatty. I think Elena already mentioned that, and we don't explicitly say this, I think, in the article, but it's a good way of framing this, that the goal here is to overwhelm capacities in the West. And I think that that's the whole point, why you would want to mount actually quite simple and operations or smaller scale operations, which really, require engagement by local police, by counterterrorism police, by other types of police intelligence to really keep them busy. So I think it is very costly for the West to be looking into all of this. I mean, but I also want to say, and there's a debate going on between the couple of us who are looking at sabotage at this point is, are we exaggerating this threat or not? And I think none of us want to exaggerate this threat. Having said that, we have seen more attacks than we really have seen since World War II, but a lot of them have been unsuccessful, and a lot of them have been really, not carried out in very professional ways. So may that be an encouragement for all of us. But obviously these, even if for instance, the people who wanted to assassinate the head of a major German manufacturing company, they're going to have to be tried. They're going to have to be investigated. This is a lot of resource. So I think you're absolutely right, Jonathan, that this is keeping a lot of the law enforcement and intelligence and security organizations actually quite busy. Whether these guys are amateurs or not, they're going to have to be tried, and their wrongdoing is going to have to be proved in the court of law, and that takes time and a lot of money and a lot of human resource.
Yes, thank you. I think an additional layer of complexity lies here when we talk about attribution. So we may very well identify people who have perpetrated these acts, and we know that they've done them. But how do we, once we know that, how do you then pursue the connection to the state that had hired them, or state agencies that had hired them to do this? And once you do that, what is the response? How do you respond politically, economically to a state that's hiring people like this to do so? So the key is attribution as well in this struggle. But in the West, it's also, I think we're having another problem, and I believe we saw part of it before 9/11, if you will, where agencies were not talking to each other, where terrorism, for instance, was a criminal issue. So it was dealt by law enforcement. Intelligence is a part of the national security structure, and deals primarily with, well, foreign policy, and when it comes to covert action and covert activities, that is where sabotage obviously would fall. That would be about foreign policy and implementing your policy, and concealing your sponsorship of such activities. But then we also have national security and armed forces. The reality of it is that we have all these resources. The problem is that, I guess, not the problem necessarily, but maybe the question is, are we using the resources that we have appropriately? Law enforcement, RICO charting, then the kingpin, what's it called, the organized crime kingpin targeting. These are all the methods that, for instance, the law enforcement has been using for years and centuries. Well, centuries I exaggerate, but for decades, right? So these are the methods the law enforcement has in their pocket. Are there other methods that intelligence agencies, are there methods that that the armed forces have available to them, where we can actually bring all these resources together and work a little bit more, rather than compartmentalizing everything and making things more costly than they need to be? So maybe that is one element where we need to reflect, and each state needs to look within to see what is it that we can do to make these acts of sabotage or attempts assassinations something that can be less costly, that can be less time consuming for a state. And I think that's where the problem lies at the moment, and we're not getting that, or we're not at least seeing that from many states.
And if I can jump in, so first of all, success or failure of sabotage, I think a failure of a sabotage that is publicized is also a type of a success, because you have people talking about it, and you have people worried about it, and you have people questioning, like, Russians are doing sabotage, like, well, why do we need to deal with that? But on the scale issue, it's very interesting, because like all of the technology in the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years has been dealing with the problem of scale, and the use of scale. So for example, if we are taking, I don't know, the Cold War, if you're taking Perry Mason, he's investigating a case, and he comes to the town, and there are like 2 taxi stations, and he wants to track his suspect. So he goes to one, and he goes to another, and then he finds the information that he needs. Well, today you have whatever taxis and the part-time drivers and Uber and maybe Get and some other venues. So it's much harder to connect all the information, to obtain all the information. Now in the West, if you are a law enforcement or intelligence, before you go and ask one of the technology companies like Google or Uber or whatever for the information that they have on a suspect, you need to go to the court, you need to show probable cause, you need to do all the prep work. Now, if we're talking sabotage at scale, gig economy type sabotage, it adds an extra layer of load on everybody. So yes, there are companies that can facilitate this information, but are you gonna reduce the personal liberties and personal privacy in favor of tracking potential sabotage? Either way, you're playing to the side of the sabotage perpetrators, because hey, whichever route you take, it's going to work for them one way or another.
Well, we've only got time for one more question, and I think we should leave on hopefully not a completely alarmist question, but you did mention earlier that these sabotage acts, they may have sort of short and medium-term objectives, destabilizing, sowing terror and so on, and disquiet, wasting resources, in distracting us from supporting Ukraine, these kind of things. But if we take a longer-term view, should we be worried that actually these kind of sort of grey zone sabotage attacks may be used in the run-up for Moscow is ready to challenge Article 5, that it may use these kind of attacks to test our willingness right up to the point where it is actually ready to do something which technically might infringe Article 5? Do we see evidence of that taking place?
I haven't seen anything that would suggest that this is where Moscow's going with it. But I think we now have a person in charge in the Kremlin, who seems to make decisions not based on strategic interests of his country and based on the military doctrine of the military his generals are in charge of, but makes decisions in a very random way. So this might be a plan behind this sabotage operation. I would be surprised if this was a way Putin would like to instigate war with the West, because ultimately it is taking a long time, and they have people who are engaging with this. They had to find ways to do this. It's actually complicated to plan this, even though that they're recruiting these agents, executioners, from the comfort of their living room or perhaps office. It still takes a long time to plan these things. So I'd be surprised if this was the ultimate goal. But I think over the past couple of years, we've gotten used to the fact that we should be ready for all kinds of surprises coming from Moscow.
Elena, I mean, if we are not willing to push back, or if we don't show the willpower to push back against these acts of sabotage, might Putin interpret that as perhaps an unwillingness to defend the Baltics, for instance?
I don't presume to be able to view into his mind, but when we're saying that we don't see these activities as being in strategic interests of Russia, I think we're omitting the strategic culture, right? Because what to us seems like, who would want to do that, right? This is crazy. To them, it might be a logical next step for the progression. And if we look at Putin, who is a trained KGB officer, although not of the highest caliber, but still, education is a lot, and all the approach of Russian and Soviet military, that the best way to win a war is without actually fighting a war, right? So you would instigate those activities to demoralize and present your, win a war without actually, sacrificing any of your soldiers. Not that there was any problem with that, as we see in Ukraine, 200,000 dead at least. I think this is a potential approach, and it's a low-hanging fruit, right? There's nothing that threatens Russia, because even with attribution, and I agree with Magda, it's a problem, but like in cybersecurity, the attribution now happens that much faster than it used to even 5 years ago. It's still in the eyes of, if not in the West, then in the global South, it represents, it can be painted as American aggression or Western aggression, or, supporting the idea of the golden billion that Patrushev and others are running with. I don't think the plan is to go to a full-on military confrontation with NATO. I don't think that this is in their interests, and even they see that it's not in their interests. But to raise the level of chaos, to push countries, states off their foot, and instill in this sense of uncertainty, it definitely works in Russian interests.
Magda, the last word on this goes to you.
Well, I actually, you won't be surprised to hear this, agree with my colleagues. I would be very reticent to call Moscow's behavior a direct challenge to Article 5 for now. I mean, in Moscow's opinion, a lot of the actions that they're doing is actually a defense rather than offense, right? They believe that the West has prompted their behavior and they're just responding. But one of the key points that we need to keep reminding ourselves is that you know, sabotage is designed to weaken, to sow dissent, to heighten uncertainty, weaponize friction. And what that tells me is that there's so much friction in our society already, even without Russia meddling and exploiting these weaknesses, that we have a whole other sets of problems that we need to deal with, which is basically how do we fix our societies where we're not so divided, where these fissures in our societies are not so exploitable that Russia's not using them against us. So that is something that it's not just, we cannot go around blaming Russia or other state for creating the chaos that is ensuing, that's growing, but we also state and have to reflect on what are some major problems that we're having in our divided society. I mean, the US being one of them, for instance. So I think this is something that also needs to be considered when we're talking about whether Russia is really truly pushing, directly challenging Article 5 and wants to escalate things, or if it's just using our own things and problems against ourselves.
Well, that's a very powerful place to stop. I strongly recommend the audience read the full article. There is so much more in there, and it certainly bears reading several times to get all of the detail out of it. But for today, I'm massively grateful to Magda, Elena, and Daniela for joining the audience today to take us through this sort of difficult and challenging topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.